To the world, she was the very meaning of an age. A small woman in unrelieved black, her face set into the stern, unsmiling mask that stared out from 1 billion coins and stamps and marble busts across 1/4 of the earth. Queen Victoria, Priya of India, the grandmother of Europe. For more than 60 years she reigned over the largest empire in human history, and she lent her name to an entire century of iron morality, of industry and restraint and respectable silence. That is the legend. But the legend was a mask, and behind it stood a woman. The age she named would scarcely have recognized. Behind closed doors there was a mother who ruled her children with a coldness that bordered on cruelty. There was a widow whose grief hardened, over 40 long years, into something close to madness. A woman who had fresh clothes laid out each morning for a husband who had been dead for decades. There were 2 men, an outspoken Highland servant and a young clerk from India, whose place at her side scandalized a court and a kingdom. And there was a secret carried in her very blood, a flaw she would pass all unknowing into the royal houses of Russia, Spain, and Germany, and that would help drag 3 of them into ruin. This is not the story of the queen on the coins. This is the story of the woman behind them. And it begins as so much of her darkness began, in a locked room in a palace, with a little girl who was never, for a single moment, allowed to be alone. She was born in the late spring of 1819, in a plain set of rooms at Kensington Palace, and from almost her first breath she was an inconvenience to the men who measured such things. They christened her Alexandrina Victoria, a Russian name and a foreign one, neither of them very English, for a child who was not, at that moment, expected ever to be queen. 3 grown uncles stood ahead of her in the line of succession. The great gilded machine of the monarchy had no particular need of one more infant princess in a draughty corner of a London palace, but the machine was failing. The sons of mad old King George were aging, dissolute and, between them, catastrophically short of living legitimate children. And so quietly, before she could even walk, a series of royal deaths began to carry the little girl at Kensington toward the front of the line. The first of those deaths was her own father's. Edward, Duke of Kent, was a vast, genial, hopelessly extravagant man, forever one step ahead of his creditors. In the winter of 1820, when Victoria was 8 months old, he took his young family to the Devon coast to economize, caught a chill walking in the wet, and was dead of pneumonia within days. He was buried in January. 6 days after that, his own father, the old king, died too. In the space of a single week, before she had spoken her first word, the baby had lost both her father and her sovereign, and her German mother was left a widow in a foreign country, deep in debt, clutching an heir to a throne she barely understood. Into that frightened vacuum stepped a man named John Conroy. He was an Irish army officer, handsome, plausible, and boundlessly ambitious, who had served the late Duke and now made himself indispensable to the grieving Duchess. He became the comptroller of her household, the manager of her money, her decisions, and, in time, very nearly her mind. And Conroy understood something about the small girl in the nursery that would shape her entire childhood. She was not merely a princess, she was a prize. Whoever controlled Victoria when she came to the throne would in effect control England. So he set out to control her utterly. Together, Conroy and the Duchess devised a regime that historians would later call the Kensington system, an elaborate, suffocating architecture of rules governing every hour of the young princess's life. Its purpose, beneath the language of protection and care, was chillingly precise. It was designed to keep Victoria weak, isolated, frightened. So dependent upon her mother and her mother's comptroller, that should she inherit the crown while still young, she would have no choice but to lean on them and let them rule the country through her. The details of the cage were almost unbelievable. She was never, ever left alone. not for a moment. She slept every night in her mother's bedroom, in a small bed beside the Duchess's own, until she was very nearly a woman grown. She was forbidden to walk down a single flight of stairs without an adult holding her hand, not for her safety, but so that she could never take an unsupervised step in any direction. She was kept apart from other children almost entirely and permitted no private conversation with anyone. A governess or her mother was present at every lesson, every meal, every visit. Her diet was plain to the point of monotony. Her days were logged, her conduct was recorded, page after page, in books kept expressly to catalogue the moods and failings of a little girl. It was a childhood conducted under surveillance. And at the centre of it, always watching, always calculating, was Conroy, a man the princess would come to loathe with a cold and total passion. In later years she is said to have called him nothing less than the devil incarnate. There were, in all that grey, a few small points of warmth. The first was her governess, a sharp, devoted, German-born woman named Louise Lazen, who loved the child fiercely and became her one true ally inside the palace walls. The single adult whose loyalty was to Victoria herself and not to the ambitions being built upon her. The second was a spaniel named Dash, the one companion who asked nothing of her and reported to no one. The third was a strange and telling comfort, her dolls. Victoria kept well over 100 of them, small wooden figures that she and Lazen dressed by hand, each with its own name and its own history, an entire miniature court, obedient and ordered, over which a powerless girl could rule absolutely. In a life in which she controlled nothing, she built herself a tiny kingdom she was not, whatever Conroy hoped, a weak child. That was his great miscalculation. Beneath the caged obedience there ran a will of extraordinary strength, and every so often it showed. There was the day when she was around 11 that Lazen slipped a chart of the royal line of succession into her history book, and the princess studied it in silence and understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly how near she stood to the throne. She is said to have looked up and declared simply that she would be good. The story may have grown in the telling, but it caught something true. Even as a child, she grasped the weight of what was coming, and she meant to be equal to it on her own terms, not theirs. Her half-sister had already shown her the only exit. Theodora, the Duchess's elder daughter, from her first marriage, had escaped the household years before through the single door available to a princess, marriage, fleeing into a German match to get free of Conroy's reach. She would later look back on those Kensington years, biographers tell us, as a kind of imprisonment, and count herself fortunate to have gotten out. Victoria had no such door. She could only wait, and endure, and grow harder. And then came the moment they finally overreached. In the autumn of 1835, when Victoria was 16, the family was staying at Ramsgate on the Kent coast when the princess fell gravely, dangerously ill, most likely with typhoid fever. For weeks she lay weak and burning, at times close to death. And it was there, at the bedside of a sick teenage girl, that Conroy and the Duchess made their move. They came to her with a document and a demand that she sign a paper promising to make Conroy her private secretary, her closest official, her right hand. The moment she became queen, it would have handed him the keys to her reign. They pressed her when she was too ill to rise. They pressed her again and again. And again and again she refused. Even feverish, even frightened, even half-conscious. The girl they had spent 16 years trying to break would not put her name to that page. Lazen stayed at her side. Victoria held out, and slowly she recovered, with something now settled and hard inside her that no amount of surveillance would ever soften again. They had shown her at last, and completely, exactly who they were. She would not forget it. And she would not forgive it. There was one man, at least, who saw what was being done to her and despised it. Her uncle, the King, William IV, loathed Conroy and distrusted the Duchess, and he watched with mounting fury as they paraded the young heir about the country like a rival court while keeping her from his own. In the summer of 1836, at his birthday banquet, with 100 guests looking on and the Duchess seated pointedly at his side, the old king rose and said aloud what the rest of them had only whispered. He prayed, he announced, that God would spare him just long enough until his niece came of age at 18, so that the crown might pass to her directly and never fall into the hands of the woman now sitting beside him, whose conduct toward the girl he called insulting and unworthy. It was an extraordinary scene, a public rupture in the royal family laid bare over the dinner plates, and it turned Victoria's approaching 18th birthday into a race against the calendar. If the king died before it, her mother would rule in her name as regent. If he lived a single day beyond it, Victoria would rule alone. She turned 18 on the 24th of May, 1837. The king held on, just. She was a prisoner in a palace, watched every hour of every day, permitted nothing that was truly her own. But less than 2 years after that sick room at Ramsgate, the child they had tried to break would wake one June morning as the most powerful woman on earth. And the very first thing she did as queen would be an act of quiet, devastating revenge. It came for her in the small hours of a summer morning. At Windsor, 20 miles to the west, her uncle the king had been failing for days. William IV, the bluff old sailor, who had prayed aloud to live long enough to keep the crown from the Duchess of Kent's grasp, had won his last wager with the calendar. He had held on past Victoria's 18th birthday. Now, in the early hours of the 20th of June, 1837, that final duty discharged, he let go. He died a little after 2 in the morning. And before the sun had climbed over the gardens, 2 men were already riding for Kensington to wake the girl who was now their queen. They were the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Howley, and the Lord Chamberlain, the Marquis Conyngham. What followed has passed into legend, and for once the legend is very nearly true. They reached the palace as the grey light was breaking, and they knocked, and no one came. They rang, and were left standing in the courtyard. The household that had watched Victoria's every movement for 18 years was, on the one morning that mattered most, fast asleep. It was some time before a servant could be roused, and longer still before the Duchess of Kent was persuaded to wake her daughter. And here, in the very first minutes of her reign, Victoria did something quietly extraordinary. She came down alone. For 18 years she had not been permitted to walk a single flight of stairs without a hand at her elbow. Now, at 6 in the morning, the new queen rose from her bed, put on a plain dressing gown, and went down to meet the 2 kneeling statesmen by herself. No mother, no governess, no comptroller at her shoulder. It was the smallest of gestures. It was also a declaration. Lord Conyngham knelt and told her that her uncle was dead and that she was queen. The Archbishop offered his homage. She was 18 years old, still in her nightclothes, and she was, in that instant, sovereign of the greatest empire on earth. He did not falter. That was the thing that astonished everyone who came near her in those first strange hours. And that same day the child began, one after another, to break every bar of the cage she had lived in. She asked, and it was a request no one could now refuse, for a single hour alone. The first, by her own account, of her whole life. She gave the order that her little bed be carried out of her mother's room that very night after 18 years of enforced closeness. And upon Sir John Conroy, the man who had ruled her childhood and schemed so long for her dependence, she visited a revenge all the colder for its politeness. He was not arrested, he was not denounced. He was simply frozen out, barred from her presence, refused the office he had demanded at her sickbed, left to understand that his long investment in her weakness had come, at last, to nothing. Before long he would slip abroad, pensioned and defeated. She never received him at her court again, the prisoner had become the queen, and the jailers in a single morning had become nobody at all. That afternoon she met her privy council for the first time, a room of grey and powerful men, dukes and bishops and ministers of state, many of whom had expected a frightened, biddable girl they might guide with a firm hand. Instead, they found a composure so complete it unsettled them. She read her declaration in a clear, steady voice. She signed her name, Victoria, the single word she would use for the rest of her days, the Alexandrina of her christening set aside forever. Wellington himself, the victor of Waterloo, was said to have remarked that she could not have conducted herself with more perfect grace had she done it for years. But even a queen of 18 needed a guide. And into that place stepped the one man who would shape the whole first act of her reign. His name was William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne, her Prime Minister, and the most unlikely tutor imaginable for a sheltered girl. Melbourne was 58, urbane, melancholy, and worldly to his bones. A man who had known love and scandal and terrible private loss, whose marriage had ended in public humiliation, and whose only son was dead. He had every reason to be cynical. Mostly he was. Yet in the young queen he found something that reached past all of it, and in him she found the father she had never had. Lord M, she called him. For hour upon hour they sat together, and he taught her the whole business of ruling, the ministers, the parties, the old hatreds of the great families, always in his easy, affectionate way. She filled her journal with their talk, in an adoration that was almost a daughter's, and perhaps something warmer still. For the first time in her life, Victoria was happy. Within weeks she had left Kensington for Buckingham Palace, making it the sovereign's London home as it has remained ever since. She rode, she danced until dawn, she did precisely as she pleased. The crowning of that new life came on the 28th of June, 1838. Her coronation drew a tide of humanity into London, 400,000 visitors, a throng such as the capital had never seen, pouring in to see the girl queen carried to Westminster Abbey. Inside, the ancient ceremony unfolded in all its cumbersome, half-rehearsed glory. It ran for 5 hours, and scarcely anyone seemed certain of the choreography. The Archbishop forced the coronation ring onto the wrong finger, jamming it into place, until it caused her real pain. She would bathe her hand in iced water afterward to work it free. An aged peer, Lord Roll, past 80, stumbled and tumbled down the carpeted steps as he climbed to pay homage, and the young queen rose and came forward to spare him the climb again. It was pageantry stretched thin over an untested reign, great crown lowered onto a very young head. And beneath the spectacle, the girl in the golden robes was learning that the crown did not make her loved. It only made her watched, as she had always been watched. Now, by a whole nation, she would learn that lesson hard, and soon. The first blow came from within her own household, and it revealed a streak in Victoria's nature as cold as anything Conroy had ever shown her. A lady-in-waiting to her mother, Lady Flora Hastings, unmarried, and numbered among Conroy's circle, which was enough to earn the Queen's dislike, fell ill early in 1839 with a swelling of the belly. The court, and Victoria among the whisperers, leapt to the cruelest conclusion that the unmarried woman was with child, and the father was Conroy himself. The rumour was allowed to spread and curdle. Lady Flora, humiliated at last, submitted to a medical examination to clear her name, and it found her a virgin. The swelling was a tumour on her liver, and it killed her that summer. The post-mortem laid the truth bare, and the public turned upon the Queen with fury. She was hissed in her carriage and jeered at the races. The golden girl of the coronation had, in a matter of months, shown her country a glimpse of the hardness underneath. And then, that same spring, came the crisis that proved she would bend for no one. Melbourne's government was crumbling. When he moved to resign, the Queen was expected to send for the Tory leader, Sir Robert Peel, in his place. She dreaded it, for it meant losing her Lord M. Peel, seeking some ordinary sign of her confidence, asked that a few of her ladies of the bedchamber, the wives and sisters of his Whig opponents, be replaced with women of his own party. By every custom she ought to have granted it. She refused, flatly, absolutely. She would not surrender a single one of her ladies, and without that gesture, Peel would not take office. The Tories withdrew, Melbourne came back. Girl of 19 had faced down the leaders of Parliament and won, by sheer force of will. They called it the bedchamber crisis, and it taught the political nation a lesson it would not forget. The girl could not be moved. She had sworn that no one would ever govern her again. She would keep that vow for exactly 3 years, until a young man with grave, beautiful eyes stepped down from a carriage at Windsor, and Victoria, Queen of England, felt the solid floor of her certainty tilt beneath her feet. The young man had a name and a lineage, and a purpose that had been fixed for him long before he was old enough to understand it. He was Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and he was her first cousin. His father was the brother of Victoria's own mother. The 2 children had been born within 3 months of each other, in that same year of 1819, into the same small, ambitious German house, brought into the world, so it was said, by the very same midwife. And, from almost the moment of their births, one man had looked upon these 2 infant cousins and begun, patiently, to dream. That man was their uncle, Leopold. Leopold of Saxe-Coburg was the most quietly formidable figure in the whole family, a prince who had very nearly become the consort of a British queen once already. Years before, he had married Princess Charlotte, the heir to the British throne, only to lose her in childbirth, and to watch the crown he might have stood beside slip away from him forever. He had since made himself king of the Belgians. But he had never surrendered the old ambition, and in Albert, serious, beautiful, gifted, and conveniently Victoria's own blood, he saw the means to win at one remove what fate had denied him directly. He would set a Coburg beside the throne of England after all. So Albert was raised for Victoria, much as a racehorse is raised for a single race. He was educated with a punishing thoroughness, schooled in statecraft by Leopold's own trusted adviser, the shrewd Baron Stockmar, and groomed in his manners, his languages, his morals, and his mind, all toward the day he would be presented to the cousin who was to be queen. They had met once before, in 1836, when Victoria was 17 and not yet on the throne. She had thought him handsome enough then, but nothing had been settled. Now she was queen, 3 years into her reign, wilful and content, and no hurry whatever to marry. She had told Lord Melbourne more than once that she was quite happy exactly as she was. Then, on the 10th of October, 1839, Albert stepped down from a travelling carriage in the courtyard at Windsor, and everything Victoria believed about her own heart came apart in an instant. The change in her was immediate and total. She had remembered a pleasant boy. She was wholly unprepared for the grave, elegant, serious man who now stood before her, with those beautiful eyes and that air of quiet gravity. She was, by her own besotted account in her journal, undone. Within 3 days her mind was made up, and here the ordinary order of the world had to be turned upside down. For Victoria was the sovereign, and no man, not even a suitor, could presume to propose marriage to the Queen of England. She would have to do it herself. On the 15th of October, 5 days after his arrival, she summoned Albert and, nervous by her own account, asked him to be her husband. He accepted at once. The girl who had sworn that no one would ever govern her again had just proposed, freely and gladly, to the one person who would. They were married on the 10th of February, 1840, the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace. And Victoria, who did nothing by halves, made of that wedding a quiet revolution. She wore not the silver and heavy state robes expected of a queen, but a gown of white satin, trimmed with Honiton lace, and upon her head not a crown, but a simple wreath of orange blossom. White, at the time, was not the color of brides. After that February morning, it became so, and remains so, in churches across half the world to this day. It was one of the very few purely happy days of her whole life, and she seemed to know it even as she lived it. She had married, she believed, the most perfect man alive. Theirs would be a genuine and consuming love, the fixed center of everything that followed. In truth, she had merely exchanged one kind of surrender for another. But this time, he had chosen it. The trouble was that no one else had. To the British public, and to the men who governed alongside her, Albert was a foreigner, a penniless princeling out of an obscure German court, come to live off the Queen and the country. Parliament made its feelings plain. It slashed the annuity proposed for him from £50,000 to 30. It refused him a peerage. It haggled over his precedence as though he were a tradesman. For the first years of the marriage he had no settled role at all. Kept from the Queen's official papers, shut out of her business, left to blot her signatures and to stand a careful pace behind her, it galled him bitterly. "I am only the husband," he is said to have written to a friend, "and not the master in the house." But slowly, deliberately, that changed, and the change would remake the monarchy itself. The turning point was the nursery. As Victoria's pregnancies came, one after another, and drew her again and again away from her desk, it was Albert who quietly took up the papers she could not attend to. He obtained a key to the ministerial boxes. He drafted her memoranda, sat in upon her meetings, and by slow degrees made himself the very thing Parliament had refused to name him, her private secretary in all but title, and then, in plain fact, a second sovereign labouring at her side. He drove out the last rival for her devotion, her old governess Ledson, who was eased from the household in 1842. He took the chaotic royal finances and the sprawling, wasteful palaces in hand, with a German passion for order. Where Victoria was impulsive and emotional, Albert was methodical, high-minded, tireless. He became her conscience and her manager, the cool, steady engine behind the throne, and she came to defer to him in almost everything. And Albert dreamed on a scale to match the age. He was not content to manage a household. He meant to remodel a monarchy and to bend the great new industrial century toward noble ends. He built Osborne House, an Italian palace above the sea on the Isle of Wight, as a private world where the royal family might live almost as ordinary gentlefolk. And in 1851 he staged the triumph of his life, Great Exhibition, a vast celebration of the industry and art of all the world, housed in a shimmering cathedral of iron and glass in Hyde Park, that the age christened the Crystal Palace. 6 million people came. It made a great fortune, which he poured into the founding of the museums of South Kensington, monuments to learning that stand to this day. For a man who had arrived a despised foreigner, it was a vindication beyond any answer. The prince nobody had wanted had made himself the presiding genius of the nation. It very nearly killed him to do it. For Albert drove himself without mercy, and his constitution had never been strong. He worked through exhaustion and through illness, rose before the dawn, sat late at his desk by candlelight, and burned away his slender reserves of health, year upon year, in the service of a country that had never quite warmed to him. Only in 1857, after 17 years of marriage, 17 years in which he had already governed in all but name, did Victoria at last force through the formal honour so long denied him. By her own command he was made Prince Consort. It was, in the end, only a word. He had held the whole substance of power for the better part of 2 decades. For 21 years he would be her husband, her secretary, her conscience, and very nearly her God. Together they set out to breed a dynasty that would sit on every throne in Europe, but Victoria hid a secret about motherhood that would have appalled her, adoring fertile subjects. She could not bear it. 9 children in 17 years. That was the plain arithmetic of Victoria's marriage, a child on average every other year, from the first winter after her wedding to the far edge of her childbearing life. 9 small lives, born between 1840 and 1857, and every last one of them lived to grow up. Vicky came first, in the November after the wedding, then Bertie, then Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and, at the very last, Beatrice. In an age when the churchyards of England were crowded with the headstones of children who had not survived a single winter, when even the richest families expected to bury 1 or 2 before they were grown, it was a run of fortune that seemed almost providential. To the watching world, it was the very image of blessed, fertile, unimpeachable womanhood, the mother of a dynasty, blooming year upon year at the still center of the nation. The nation did not know what the mother, privately, thought of it all. For, behind the official serenity, behind the golden winter halter portraits of the royal family, Victoria regarded the whole business of childbearing with something close to dread. She loved Albert with a physical intensity that half scandalized even herself. What she did not love, and never once pretended to, was the price her own body was made to pay for that love. She hated being pregnant, and said so, again and again, to the handful of people she trusted with the truth of it. To be with child was, in her eyes, to be robbed of everything that made her herself, her freedom, her figure, her queenly dignity, and reduced, she is said to have written, to something less than a woman, a creature kept for breeding. The 9 pregnancies she endured were not to her 9 joys. They were 9 sentences to be served. Nor did the arrival of the child bring the relief the poets promised. Victoria felt little of the melting rapture her age demanded of new mothers, and she was honest enough, or hard enough, to admit it. A very young baby, she is reported to have written, was no thing of beauty but something faintly repellent, frog-like, in its helpless, twitching ugliness. There was something darker still, which the language of her time could barely name. After more than one confinement, she sank into long spells of blackness and weeping and unaccountable rage, a heaviness of the mind that fell without warning and lifted, just as mysteriously, the shadow side, she is said to have called it, of her marriage. And yet the children kept coming, because whatever it cost her, the dynasty required them. In the middle of all this came one act of genuine courage, one that would change women's lives far beyond the palace walls. In the spring of 1853, laboring with her 8th child, Leopold, Victoria did what no queen before her had dared. She accepted the mask. A quiet, brilliant physician named John Snow, soon to be famous for tracing a cholera outbreak to a single Soho water pump, was brought to her bedside to administer chloroform, the new and still distrusted anesthetic, dulling the agony of birth as she breathed it in. She found the effect, by her own account, soothing beyond anything she had imagined. It was a quiet revolution. The medical journals warned that the drug might be perilous to mother and infant alike. The clergy were worse. Pain in childbirth, they thundered, had been ordained by God himself in the book of Genesis. The curse of Eve, a sacred suffering no daughter of the fall had any right to escape. For a doctor to lift it with a bottle and a folded cloth was to meddle with divine judgment. Victoria answered the argument simply by surviving it radiantly, and doing it all again 4 years later at the birth of Beatrice. If chloroform was good enough for the Queen of England, it was good enough for the wives and daughters of England, and so it passed into fashion under a knowing new name, chloroform à la reine, the anesthetic of the Queen. In refusing for once to suffer, she had done more for the ordinary women of her century than 100 royal speeches ever could. But, If Victoria could be merciful to strangers, she was a far colder proposition inside her own nursery. Here, once again, the past reached forward its long hand. The girl who had been raised inside the suffocating machinery of the Kensington system, timetabled, catalogued, watched every hour of every day, grew into a mother who governed her own children with much the same iron. Difference now was only in the architect. For the master of the royal nursery was Albert, earnest, tireless, quietly certain that he could engineer perfection in his offspring as in all things. He devised for them a program of ceaseless improvement, lessons from the early morning, a punishing regimen of languages and science and moral instruction, every hour accounted for, every lapse recorded. The children were to be model creatures, faultless advertisements for their parents' preached virtues. For most of them it was merely hard. For one of them it was a slow catastrophe. Albert Edward, Bertie, the Prince of Wales, the boy on whom the entire future of the crown depended, was no scholar, and no weight of pressure could make him one. He was warm, restless, easily bored, hungry for affection rather than Latin grammar, and the harder his parents drove him, the more he balked and wept and raged. His tutors despaired of him, and his mother, watching her heir fall so far short of the paragon her husband demanded, grew not gentler toward him, but colder. She saw in Bertie's face and temper an unwelcome echo of her own wild Hanoverian blood, the very inheritance Albert had schooled out of her, and she recoiled from it. Where she doted without reserve on her clever, adored eldest daughter, she looked upon her son with a chronic disappointment that would sour the two of them for life. And all the while, even in the schoolroom, the children were being aimed. Victoria and Albert did not regard their children merely as children, they saw them as instruments, pieces in a vast dynastic design meant to bind the royal houses of Europe together in a single web of Coburg blood and English influence. From the nursery they were being pointed, like a quiver of arrows. At the thrones of Prussia and Hesse, and Russia and beyond, the first arrow flew early. Icke, the brilliant favourite, was betrothed at just 14 to Prince Frederick William of Prussia and married off to Berlin at 17, a girl scarcely grown, sent to carry English liberalism into the heart of a rising Germany. Her brothers and sisters would follow one by one into the palaces of the continent. It was, Victoria believed, the great work of her life, a family seated upon every throne that mattered. She could not have known what else she was sending out along those bloodlines, for among the 9, there was one child who was not quite well. Leopold, the very son whose birth the chloroform had eased, grew into a frail and frightening puzzle. He bruised at the lightest knock. He bled from the smallest cut or stumble in ways no physician of the age could explain or arrest. His mother, who had so little patience for weakness, fretted over him and found him trying by turns. The doctors spoke vaguely of delicacy and watched him with grave faces. No one yet had a name for what was wrong with the boy. No schedule of Albert's, no regimen of improvement, no clever marriage could ever correct it, for the flaw was not in his rearing, it was in his blood. And it had come to him, all unsuspected, from his mother. But that reckoning lay years away. For now, in the high summer of the 1850 seconds, Victoria stood at the head of a large, disciplined family and told herself she wanted for nothing. 9 children aimed and ordered, an empire spreading, and, above all, Albert. For here was the deepest truth of her middle years, the one her adoring subjects never grasped. She had not merely married Albert, she had dissolved herself into him. He was her husband and her lover, but also her private secretary, her political tutor, the manager of her moods, the hand that guided her pen and very nearly her mind. A queen who had sworn as a caged girl that no one would ever govern her again, had made one man the government of her entire soul. She had built her whole existence upon one man. Her husband, her minister, her sovereign in all but name. And in the winter of 1861, over the space of just 21 days, that entire world would be taken from her in a single upstairs room. History would blame a fever. Victoria would blame her own son. Some years do not merely pass. They descend, one blow falling after another, until the soul enduring them can do nothing but stand and brace for the next. For Victoria, the year 1861 was such a year. Before it had run its course, it would strip from her the two people who had, between them, framed her entire life. The mother who had made her, and the man who had remade her, and it would leave the most powerful woman on earth a broken thing in widow's black, from which, in the deepest sense, she would never truly return. It began in the spring, with the death of her mother. The Duchess of Kent, the woman who had built the cage of Victoria's childhood, who had shared her bedroom and governed her every step at the bidding of the hated Conroy, died at Frogmore, below Windsor, on the 16th of March, 1861. And her death undid her daughter in a manner no one had foreseen, for as she sat sorting through the dead woman's papers, the Queen made a devastating discovery. Her mother had kept everything. Every memento of her babyhood, a lock of infant hair, a childish letter, hoarded and treasured across all those estranged years, the coldness between them, Victoria now understood, had not been rejection at all. It had been the poisonous handiwork of Conroy, who had turned each against the other for his own ends. The love had been there all along, buried beneath his scheming, and now the woman who had felt it was dead, and it was far too late to answer her. The grief that followed was frightening in its violence. Victoria wept for weeks on end. She could not eat, could not be comforted, shut herself away and mourned so wholly that those around her began to fear for her reason. It was the first time the household glimpsed what her husband had long known, that beneath the imperious surface there ran a temperament that could tip, under a hard enough blow, into something perilously close to collapse. And through all of it, one figure held the shaking house together, shouldering her neglected duties along with his own. That figure was Albert. But Albert himself was already dying, and his last months were about to be poisoned by a scandal beneath his own roof. In the summer of 1861, the Prince of Wales, 19, and chafing at last against the airless perfection of his upbringing, had been sent to the Curragh camp in Ireland for a spell of military training. There, his brother officers smuggled a woman into his quarters. A lively young actress named Nellie Clifton soon passed about the messrooms as the future king's mistress. By the autumn, the story had crossed the Irish Sea and seeped into the drawing rooms of London society. And in November, at the worst of all possible moments, it reached Albert. To a man of the Prince Consort's rigid and anxious morality, it was a catastrophe out of all proportion to the deed. It was not merely that his son had sinned. It was that the sin threatened everything: the boy's reputation, the delicate marriage negotiations with the Danish Princess Alexandra, the whole spotless image of the monarchy Albert had labored 20 years to raise up. He is said to have written to Bertie that the affair had caused him the deepest pain he had ever known. He was already a sick man when he set down those words, worn thin by 2 decades of overwork, sleepless, plagued by the stomach troubles that had dogged him for years. He was in no fit state to travel. He went regardless. At the end of November, wretched and shivering, Albert made his way to Cambridge, where Bertie was nominally a student, to confront his erring son face to face. The two men walked together for hours, talking it out, the father forgiving, the son contrite. And it rained. Albert, already sickening, was chilled and soaked through, and returned to Windsor worse than he had left it. For generations afterward, it would be said that this walk in the cold rain was what killed the Prince Consort, that Bertie's disgrace had, quite literally, dragged his father into the grave. It was a story Victoria would seize upon in her anguish and never release, and it would cost her son more dearly than he could ever have guessed. Back at Windsor, Albert did not recover. Through the first weeks of December he sank, restless, aching, unable to sleep or to settle, drifting from room to room as the fever tightened its grip. His physicians, the eminent Sir James Clark and Dr. William Jenner among them, conferred in low voices and settled on a name for it. Typhoid fever, the great scourge of the age, blamed on the notoriously foul drains of Windsor itself. They spoke reassuringly of a turn for the better, of a recovery that wanted only a week or two. Victoria believed them because she could not bear to do otherwise. Even as Albert visibly wasted before her, she clung to the doctor's comfort with a willed blindness, refusing to grasp what was unfolding in her own home. It was their daughter, Alice, just 18, and grave far beyond her years, who saw the truth of it first, who nursed her father through his final days with unflinching tenderness, and who understood at last that Bertie must be sent for before it was too late. But was moved in the end into the Blue Room, the very chamber, it was long said, in which 2 earlier kings had breathed their last. And there, on the evening of Saturday the 14th of December 1861, it ended. Victoria was at the bedside, and 5 of their 9 children were gathered in the room when the Prince Consort's breathing grew shallow and slower, and then, a little before 11 o'clock, simply ceased. He was 42 years old. His wife did not cry out. She took the hand that was already cooling in her own, and, for a long and dreadful moment, seemed unable to comprehend that the warmth she had leaned upon for 21 years had gone out of the world forever. Something in Victoria broke in that room that would never afterward be mended. But even in the first black hours of her grief, her stricken mind was already groping for a reason. Cause, someone to hold to account for the unbearable fact of Albert's death. And it fastened, with a terrible finality, upon her eldest son. She had convinced herself that it was worry over Bertie's disgrace, the shame of the Coburg, that dreadful walk through the rain, which had shattered Albert's health and hurried his end. Her boy had killed his father. She is reported to have written that she could never again look upon Bertie without a shudder. And whatever her exact words, the sentiment behind them was real and lasting. A mother's grief had curdled into something close to revulsion for the son who would one day be king, and the wound between them would never wholly heal. And yet the accusation almost certainly rested upon a falsehood. For it is far from clear that Bertie, or the rain, or the drains of Windsor, had anything at all to do with what truly ailed Albert. Typhoid fever was the verdict, written on the certificate, and repeated to a mourning world, and in an age of primitive sanitation it was plausible enough. But Albert had been unwell, chronically, grindingly unwell, for far longer than any sudden fever could account for, complaining of pain and wasting for 2 years and more before the end. Modern physicians and biographers, sifting the evidence, have argued that he was most likely dying of something slower and deeper than typhoid, a chronic disease of the gut, perhaps the condition we now call Crohn's, or an abdominal cancer that had been consuming him for years. The truth can no longer be known with certainty. The fever that history blamed may have been only the last act of a tragedy long underway, and the son his mother could not forgive may have been guilty of nothing at all. Victoria would entertain no such doubts. For her, the matter was closed, the loss absolute, the date itself accursed. Ever after, to the end of her long life, she would speak of the 14th of December only as the terrible day, and keep its dark anniversary alone, in seclusion and in tears. And she could not have known, and it was perhaps a mercy that she could not, that the date was not yet finished with her family, but the 14th of December still held, waiting in the years ahead one more blow every bit as cruel as this one. The prince was gone. He was 42 years old, but the woman he left behind would spend the next 40 years refusing, in every way that mattered, to admit that he was dead, and she would try to drag the entire British monarchy down into the tomb beside him. She did not scream. That was what those nearest to her would remember of the first hours. But the woman whose grief was about to darken a nation and define an entire age made, at the end, almost no sound at all. She had knelt at the bed in the blue room. She had kissed the cooling forehead of the man who had been her husband, her secretary, her conscience, and, very nearly, her God. And then she was led away down the long corridors of Windsor, and somewhere inside her a door swung shut that would not open again for 40 years. The world expected her to grieve. No one expected what she did instead. For Victoria did not simply mourn Albert, she enshrined him. In the raw days after his death, she began to issue a series of quiet, exact instructions, and out of them grew one of the strangest household rituals in the entire history of the English crown. The prince's rooms were to be left precisely as he had kept them. Nothing moved, nothing cleared away, the whole apparatus of a living man's mourning, fixed forever, the moment of his leaving. And each day thereafter, the servants were to carry hot water up to his dressing room, lay clean clothes across his bed, and set out fresh towels and a clean nightshirt, as though the master of the house might wake at any hour and dress for a day that would never again arrive. It did not stop at the dressing room. She had a cast taken of his hand, cool and white and perfect, and kept it where she could reach for it in the dark. Above the empty pillow, on his side of every bed she slept in every house she owned, she hung his photograph wreathed in mourning, so that the last thing she saw each night was the face of a man 10 years, then 20 years, then 30 years dead. She had herself pictured, seated beside his marble bust, her widow's cap already fixed upon her head, gazing up at the cold lightness of the living warmth she had lost. She was 42 years old. She had worn white at her wedding, and set a fashion that has lasted a century and more. Now she put on black, and she would wear it, without relief, without exception, every single day for the remaining 40 years of her life. And then, having dressed herself in mourning, she vanished. This is the part that turned a private tragedy into a public crisis. For Victoria did not grieve in the ordinary way, and then, in the fullness of time, returned to her people. She withdrew from them altogether. She fled the state-rooms of Buckingham Palace for the seclusion of Windsor, of Osborne on its quiet island, of Balmoral far away in the Highlands. She refused, for years on end, to open Parliament in person. She would not ride through her capital. She would not show her face at the great public ceremonies that were, increasingly, the only glimpse an ordinary subject would ever have of their monarch. The queen of the most powerful nation on earth simply disappeared behind her black veil into her houses and her grief. And there, for the better part of a decade, she stayed. Her people gave the vanished sovereign a name. They called her the Widow of Windsor. What she built, in place of a public life, was a kingdom of the dead. At Frogmore, in the gardens below Windsor, she raised a great mausoleum to hold Albert's body, and, in time, her own. And she went there again and again to sit in the marble silence beside his tomb. But a single mausoleum was not nearly enough. Across the country, a widow's grief hardened into granite and bronze. The Albert Memorial rose in Kensington Gardens, a gilded prince enthroned beneath a soaring Gothic canopy. The vast rotunda of the Royal Albert Hall was raised in his name. Statues of the dead consort multiplied in city squares, from one end of the kingdom to the other, until it must have seemed that the prince, in death, had at last conquered the very country that had never quite trusted him in life. She was turning England itself into a shrine, and England slowly began to resent it. Because a monarch is not merely a private person, and a crown is not a thing one may simply carry off into a darkened room and keep. The Queen was paid, and paid handsomely, out of the public purse, and as the empty years dragged on, hard questions began to be asked aloud. What, precisely, was the nation buying? Sovereign who would not be seen, who would not open her own parliament, who would not perform the single visible function her people asked of her, and yet drew her income, all the same, and had wrung further grants from the treasury to portion off children, the public scarcely ever glimpsed. In an age of reform and rising radicalism, the sums no longer looked like majesty. They began to look like a bill for services not rendered. Then, in 1870, the ground shifted beneath every throne in Europe. Across the Channel, the French Empire collapsed in war and revolution. The emperor was swept away. In Paris, the crowds proclaimed a republic, the third that France had made. If the French could dispense with the crown so easily, the argument ran, why could not the British Republican clubs open their doors in English cities? Cheap pamphlets circulated hand to hand. Crowds gathered in Trafalgar Square. And in the November of 1871, a radical member of Parliament named Sir Charles Dilke stood up at Newcastle and said the unsayable in public, that the monarchy was a costly, secretive, wasteful institution, and that the country might do better and a great deal cheaper without it altogether. For a few grey weeks that autumn, the unthinkable felt suddenly dangerously near. The crown had rarely in living memory stood so low. And then it was saved by a fever, and by an accident of the calendar so eerie that even hardened and unsentimental men remarked upon it. For in that very same late autumn of 1871, the Prince of Wales fell gravely, desperately ill. The disease was typhoid fever, the same illness that had been written on his father's death certificate exactly 10 years before. As the days shortened toward December, Bertie sank and raved and burned, and the whole nation that had been muttering against his mother found itself holding its breath instead, because the crisis was building toward a single dreadful date. The 14th of December, the 10th anniversary, to the very day of the death of Albert. It seemed, for a few terrible days, that the same disease might take the son on the same date it had taken the father. But it did not. The fever broke. The prince lived. And the relief of a watching country came pouring out in a great wave of loyalty that swept the whole Republican moment clean away. On the 27th of February 1872, the Queen did the thing she had refused to do for a decade. She came out. She rode in an open carriage through cheering, roaring streets to a service of public thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral, her pale convalescent son at her side, and London bellowed its devotion until the noise of it must surely have reached her even behind the veil. The tide had turned. The talk of republics faded almost as swiftly as it had risen. The crown, so nearly toppled, stood firm once more. Slowly over the years that followed, she would be coaxed a little further back toward the light, not least by a clever, flattering politician named Benjamin Disraeli, who understood that the surest road to the old Queen's favor ran straight through the memory of the husband she still mourned. But something had already changed in her, out there in those long grey years of seclusion, that no minister had arranged, and none of them ever quite understood. Somewhere in the silence of her hiding, the widow had found a living, breathing, human warmth to set against all that marble and mourning. And it had come from the unlikeliest quarter in her whole kingdom. The nation had all but given her up, a phantom queen, buried alive with her husband's ghost. And then out of the grey Highland mist came a rough, blunt, fearless Scotsman who did the one thing no one else had dared to do since Albert died. He made her laugh. And, almost at once, the whispering began. He was a servant. That was the first thing about John Brown, and to the horrified men and women of her court, it remained, always, the only thing that mattered. He was a gillie, a Highland outdoorsman, a gamekeeper's son, from a stone cottage near Balmoral, born in the December of 1826 and raised to the saddle, the moor and the cold. He was tall, powerfully built, and heavily bearded, with pale eyes and a way of looking at the great and the titled, as though they were at bottom no better than himself. He drank, he swore. He spoke a broad, Deeside Scots that half the English aristocracy could scarcely follow. And he was, to the utter astonishment of everyone who watched it happen, about to become the single most important person in the life of the Queen of England. Albert had noticed him first. In the happy years before the prince died, Brown had been one of the trusted men of the Balmoral estate, the servant who led the Queen's pony over the hills, who was steady and sure in rough country, who could be relied upon. Absolutely. Albert had approved of him. And that, after 1861, was a kind of sacred endorsement, for in her widowhood, Victoria clung to anything and anyone her lost husband had valued. In the autumn of 1864, still low and grey and refusing to rejoin the world, she was persuaded that Highland air and Highland exercise might do her some good, and John Brown was brought south from Balmoral to lead her pony once again. He came for a visit. He stayed for the rest of his life. By December of 1864, the arrangement had been made permanent. Brown was installed as the Queen's personal Highland servant at her side, from the morning to the night, and almost at once those around her began to notice something they could not quite put a name to. The frozen, grieving woman they had all but given up on was in the playing company of this blunt Scottish servant slowly coming back to life. Because Brown treated her as no one else on earth would have dared. Where the whole kingdom approached the Queen on bended knee, wrapped in ceremony and terror, Brown simply spoke to her, plainly, bluntly, sometimes roughly, the way a strong man speaks to a woman he has privately decided it is his business to look after. He scolded her. He bullied her out into the cold air when she wished only to hide indoors with her grief. He passed blunt judgment on her dress. He guarded her body with a ferocity that on at least one occasion, when a man rushed her carriage, may well have saved her life. It was said that he addressed her not as Your Majesty, but simply, astonishingly, as woman, and that far from punishing the familiarity, she treasured it. In a life lived entirely upon a pedestal, here at last was one person who treated her as a living human being, and not a monument. She leaned upon John Brown, as she had leaned on no one since Albert. And the court watched and stiffened and began to talk. By 1866, the talk had hardened into a name, and the name was cruel. Behind her back at first, and soon in the gutter press beyond the palace walls, they had started to call the Queen of England Mrs. Brown. It spread like a stain. Satirical magazines printed sly cartoons of the sovereign and her Highlander. Pamphlets appeared, some merely mocking, some so scandalous that the authorities moved quietly to suppress them, hinting darkly at what a lonely widowed queen and her handsome, fearless servant might be to one another behind the walls of Balmoral. And the rumours only grew wilder as they travelled, that they were lovers, that Brown was no mere servant, but a favourite in the old and dangerous sense of the word, that the two of them had been secretly married in some Highland ceremony, that the Queen had, even in the depths of her seclusion, borne the servant a child. There was no proof of any of it. There did not need to be. The picture alone, the small black-clad widow and the big rough Scot, alone together in the mists of Deeside, was far too delicious for a gossiping age to let go of. So what, then, was the truth of it? Here the honest chronicler must slow down and choose every word with care, because the pull of a good story has led a great many tellers astray. The plain fact is this: there is no evidence, none whatsoever, that Victoria and John Brown were ever lovers. The lurid tales of a secret child have never been supported by so much as a shred of documentation, and as for the whispered marriage, the entire claim rests upon a single, second-hand entry in the private diary of a courtier named Lewis Harcourt, set down long after the fact, recording a story that the Queen's chaplain, the Reverend Norman MacLeod, had supposedly confessed upon his deathbed to having performed the ceremony himself. MacLeod was no longer alive to confirm the tale or deny it. No record of any wedding was ever found. No one who claimed to know had witnessed anything at all. It is, in the end, a rumour about a rumour, and it deserves to be treated as precisely that, and nothing more. And yet the story would never quite die. It has outlived every soul who might once have settled it, precisely because Victoria herself left just enough shadow for it to live in. Her devotion to Brown was real, and public, and fierce, and, to a watching world, it looked like something far greater than a mistress owed her manservant. Whatever it truly was, love, dependence, deep friendship, or some fierce private bond, for which we simply have no tidy word, she never once troubled to explain it, and she never for a moment apologized for it. She had him at her side for 18 years, and then, in the spring of 1883, she lost him too. John Brown fell ill at Windsor in the March of that year, erysipelas, an angry infection of the skin, inflamed and worsened by years of hard drinking and harder living, and on the 27th, quite suddenly, he was gone. He was 56 years old, for Victoria was a second widowhood, and she made not the slightest effort to disguise it. She, who had turned the death of a prince into a national cult, now poured a startling measure of that same grief upon the memory of a servant. She commissioned a life-size statue of him for the grounds at Balmoral. She had memorial brooches struck in his honour. She wrote of him, openly and in warm and glowing terms, as the truest and most devoted of friends. And then she set out to write a great deal more, an entire book, a private biography of her Highland servant, till her horrified household, seeing all too clearly how such a thing would look to the world, pressed her and pressed her again, until at last, bitterly, she surrendered the project. Even the Dean of Windsor staked his own career on talking her out of it. The memoir was abandoned. Full truth of what she had felt for John Brown went in the end unspoken, but it did not, as things turned out, go entirely unrecorded. For Victoria left one last set of instructions concerning John Brown, and she left them in secret, to be carried out only after her own death, by hands she trusted to stay silent. She had settled long before what was to go into her coffin with her. The tokens of the husband she had never ceased to mourn, Albert's dressing-gown laid at her side, the plaster cast of his beloved hand. But there were to be other things placed there too. Quietly, once the family had been ushered from the room and hidden from their eyes beneath the flowers and the careful folds of her gown. Photograph of John Brown, a lock of his hair, a handful of his letters, and upon her finger the plain gold wedding ring that had once belonged to John Brown's own mother, a ring the servant had given her, and that the Queen of England had chosen, for reasons she never explained to a single living soul, to wear. She meant to carry John Brown down into the grave with her, and she would. Whatever the truth of John Brown's servant, protector, or secret husband, the Queen carried it with her into the grave, quite literally. But there was another secret hidden in Victoria's body, one she could not soothe with a lock of hair or a loyal servant. It was written into her very blood, and it had already begun to kill her children. For all the dread that childbearing had cost her, Victoria had achieved what most dynasties only prayed for. 9 children, born across 17 years, and every last one of them had lived to grow up, a near miraculous record in a century, when the nurseries of kings were haunted by small coffins as surely as the cottages of the poor. By sheer stubborn will, she had raised one of the healthiest broods of princes and princesses in all of Europe, or so it appeared, but there was something wrong with the blood. It was invisible, this flaw. It left no mark upon the skin, announced itself with no fever and no cough, and it would take the physicians of the age the better part of a lifetime even to name the thing with any confidence. We call it hemophilia now, a disorder in which the blood, for want of a single missing ingredient, will not properly clot. In an ordinary child, a fall from a pony, a bitten tongue, a knock against the edge of a table is a moment's pain and a fading bruise. In the child born with this flaw, that same small injury can become a slow and unstoppable flood, bleeding that seeps for days into the joints and the muscles, that swells the knees to agony, and that gathers, at its very worst, in the lining of the brain. And the disease obeyed a strange and pitiless rule, one that the medicine of the day could observe long before it could explain. It struck down sons, but it travelled through daughters. A woman might carry it hidden in her blood for the whole of her life and never bleed a day. Then she would pass it on to half her sons, who might suffer and die of it, and to half her daughters, who would feel nothing at all, and hand it silently onward to the generation that came after them. It was a thing given from mother to child in the dark, borne by the women and suffered by the men. Where it had come from, no one could say. There was no record of such bleeding anywhere among Victoria's ancestors, no whisper of it in the long pedigrees of Hanover and Saxe-Coburg that the heralds kept so carefully. The likeliest explanation, and the one most scholars have come to accept, is also the most unsettling, that the flaw began with Victoria herself. A single random error written into her blood before she was ever born. A spontaneous mutation that made the most powerful woman on earth the unknowing fountainhead of a curse. The particular form of it, the variant that would one day be drawn from the bones of her Russian descendants in a laboratory more than 100 years later, was probably the rarer of the two kinds, what physicians now call haemophilia B. Victoria understood none of this. She knew only that her 8th child was not like the others. He had been born in the spring of 1853, the very child whose delivery she had eased with Dr. Snow's blessed chloroform, as though some part of his coming had carried a warning. They named him Leopold, after the uncle who had shaped so much of her own life. And, almost from the cradle, it was plain that something was wrong. He bruised at the lightest touch. A tumble his brothers would have shrugged off, left him swollen and screaming for days. The smallest cut would not close. He bled from the gums, from the mouth, from hurts so trifling that no one could always say what had caused them. The palace physicians, baffled, could do little but wrap him in wadding, forbid him the rough play of boyhood, and watch. He grew into a clever, bookish, desperately frustrated boy, by the reckoning of those around him, the most intelligent of all her sons, and the most confined. While his brothers rode and shot and sailed, Leopold was swaddled in caution, denied the ordinary freedoms of a prince, because any one of them might kill him, limped from the bleeding in his joints. Passed weeks at a stretch in darkened sick rooms, and he chafed bitterly against the invisible walls his own body had built around him. His mother's feelings toward him were a knot she never fully untangled. She pitied him, fretted endlessly over his health, and wept at each new crisis. And yet she found him trying and difficult in almost equal measure. And in her letters she wrote of him at times with a coldness that is hard to read. Even now, complaining of his looks, his temper, his defiance, for defiant he was. Of all her children, it was the sick one, the fragile one, who fought her hardest, who insisted, against every instinct of a woman who had made control, the very habit of her life, that he would have a real existence, and not merely a long and careful waiting for the end. And, astonishingly, he won a measure of it. He forced his way to Oxford, where he moved among scholars and artists and grew into the most cultivated of all the royal children. He pressed his mother relentlessly for useful work until she came to lean on him, half against her will, as a private secretary and confidant in the long years of her widowhood. In 1881, she created him Duke of Albany. And in the spring of 1882, at 29, Leopold did the thing that had once seemed least possible of all. He married a calm and capable German princess, Helena of Waldeck-Pyrmont. And within a year they had a daughter, with a second child already on the way. For the first time in his life, the boy from the darkened room had a house of his own, family of his own. a future that looked, at last, like freedom. It lasted less than 2 years. In the early spring of 1884, fleeing the English damp that so tormented his condition, Leopold travelled south to Cannes on the French Riviera. There, one evening, at a club beside the sea, he slipped and fell, striking his knee. The sort of stumble a healthy man forgets by morning. He was helped to his bed. In the night, the bleeding that no one could see moved into his brain. By the next day, he was dead. It was the 28th of March, 1884. He was 30 years old, 10 days short of the birthday that would have made him 31. The son who had fought so hard to live had been undone, in the end, by a single misplaced step. They did not, in that house, speak the truth of it aloud. There was no word for haemophilia in the public notices, no admission of an inherited taint in the blood of the world's foremost royal family. The court spoke, when it spoke at all, the prince's delicacy, of his want of strength, of a fragile constitution, the soft, evasive vocabulary of a family determined that the thing should have no name. To name it would have been to confess that the flaw ran in the dynasty itself, that it might rise again, that the marriages being arranged so carefully across the courts of Europe were carrying more than crowns and territory in their wake. And Victoria, though she never spoke of it plainly, seems to have grasped the worst of it through her son's short life. There had run a darker understanding that the poison in Leopold's blood had come from her own, nor was he the only proof of it. Years before, her daughter Alice had watched her own little boy bleed to death after a childhood fall. Another small prince felled by the very same silent flaw. Leopold had merely suffered it in the open, where the whole world could see. At least 2 of Victoria's daughters, Alice, married away into Germany, and Beatrice, her youngest, carried the disease hidden in their blood exactly as their mother did, feeling nothing themselves, and were already handing it on, all unknowing, to children of their own. Leopold was the first to pay for the flaw hidden in his mother's blood. He would not be the last, for the Queen was already at work on the grand project of her widowhood, marrying her daughters and granddaughters into every royal house on the continent. She believed she was building an empire of family. In truth, she was carrying a curse across the borders of Europe. History remembers her by a title that sounds almost tender, the grandmother of Europe. And she had earned it. By the close of her long life, Victoria's children and grandchildren sat, or were promised to sit, upon very nearly every throne on the continent, in Berlin and St. Petersburg, in Madrid and Athens and Bucharest, and across a scattering of German duchies beyond easy counting. She had more than 40 grandchildren, and she presided over their marriages like a general moving pieces upon a map, binding the royal houses of Europe together into a single vast and quarrelsome family, with herself enthroned at the head of it. She believed she was knitting the continent into peace. Blood, she reasoned, would hold where treaties tore. Cousins would surely not make war upon cousins. It was a beautiful idea. It was also entirely, catastrophically wrong. For into that web of marriages, along with the crowns and the dowries and the careful dynastic calculations, Victoria wove something she could neither see nor name. The flaw in her blood went out with her daughters and her granddaughters to their foreign courts. 2 of her own daughters we now know carried it. Alice married into the German Grand Duchy of Hesse, and Beatrice, the youngest of them all. Neither ever suffered a single symptom. Both passed it faithfully on. And through them, the poison that had killed poor Leopold in his room at Cannes set out on its journey into the very heart of Europe's proudest dynasties. The greatest of the tragedies began with a daughter of Alice. Her name was Alix, a grave, auburn-haired princess of Hesse, one of the old queen's favorite grandchildren, drawn especially close to her after her mother died young. In 1894, she married Nicholas II, who had just succeeded his father as Tsar, and became Alexandra Feodorovna, Empress of all the Russias, her new dominion sprawling across a sixth of the land of the globe. She gave her husband 4 daughters in swift succession, and then in the summer of 1904, she was at last delivered of a son, Alexei, the longed-for heir to 3 centuries of Romanov autocracy. The bells of the empire rang out, and within weeks his parents saw the bleeding that would not stop and understood with horror what their grandmother's blood had carried into the cradle of the Tsars. He was a beautiful, lively, doomed child, and his life hung upon a bruise. A knock, a stumble, nosebleed that ran for days could bring him to the very edge of death. The bleeding into his joints left him screaming for weeks at a time, his small body drawn and rigid with pain. 2 sailors from the imperial yacht were assigned to shadow his every step, to carry him when he could not walk, and to catch him before he fell, and still it was never enough. His mother watched over him with a devotion that curdled, year by year, into something close to derangement. Sleepless, grief-worn, half an invalid herself, and utterly convinced that the life of her son and the fate of the dynasty were one and the same thing. The truth of his condition was hidden from the Russian people as a state secret. For how could the heir to God's own autocracy be seen to be dying by inches of a flaw that no doctor on earth could mend? And in the desperation of that hidden sick-room, a door swung open for one of the strangest and most disastrous figures in all of Russian history. His name was Grigory Rasputin, a wandering Siberian holy man, coarse, unwashed, magnetic, dissolute. He seemed able to do the one thing the finest physicians in the empire could not. When he was near, or even when only his telegrams arrived, the boy grew calm, and the bleeding eased. How? No one has ever entirely explained. To the frantic empress, it needed no explaining. He was a saint, sent by God to preserve her son, and she would hear no word against him, deny him nothing, and set his judgment above that of her ministers and her church. Near fatal crisis in the autumn of 1912, when the boy lay apparently dying, and Rasputin's message from afar seemed once more to call him back to life, sealed the mystic's hold upon her utterly, and that hold corroded everything it touched. When the Great War came in 1914, and Nicholas went to command his armies at the front, he left the government of Russia in the hands of his wife. And his wife, in her turn, leaned upon Rasputin. The court seethed with rumor of a German-born empress half enthralled to a filthy peasant, of treason whispered over the cradle of a dying child. Ministers rose and fell at the empress's whim, or at the whim of the coarse mystic behind her, till the machinery of a great empire lurched from one crisis to the next, while its rulers stood guard over a secret they dared not speak aloud. The prestige of the crown rotted quietly from within at the very hour the empire most needed it whole. In December 1916, a knot of noblemen murdered Rasputin, convinced they were rescuing the monarchy. They were far too late. Revolution swept it all away. In 1917, Nicholas abdicated. The family was seized and held under guard, shuttled at the last to a merchant's house in the Ural town of Yekaterinburg. And there, in a cellar, on a July night in 1918, the Tsar, the Empress, their 4 daughters, and the sick boy Alexei, whose illness had done so much to bring them all to that room, were shot and bayoneted to death, and their bodies carried out into the woods before dawn. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended against a stained cellar war, and in the veins of the murdered heir there had run a flaw that first stirred to life, decades before, and a continent away, in the body of an English queen at Kensington. Russia was the deepest wound, but it was not the only one. Alice had carried the disease into Germany as well. Another of her daughters, Irene, married a prince of Prussia, a brother of the Kaiser himself, and bore sons who bled. And there was still Spain. Beatrice's daughter had grown into a beautiful young woman, the family called Ina Victoria Eugenia. And in 1906, she married the young King Alfonso XIII and became Queen of Spain. It began in blood. As the wedding procession wound back through Madrid, An assassin flung a bomb hidden in a bouquet of flowers. The royal couple was spared, but it killed and maimed dozens of onlookers in the street below and spattered the bride's white gown, a terrible scarlet. It was, with hindsight, a fitting omen, for Ina carried her grandmother's flaw, and she gave it to her sons. 2 of the boys were hemophiliacs, and both would bleed to death in their turn after motor car accidents. The younger, a youth of 19, the elder, a man of 31. Small collisions on ordinary roads that would have left a healthy man bruised and shaken, and that killed these princes slowly from the inside. Another of her sons was born deaf. Of the 4 boys, only one would reach untroubled manhood. Alfonso came to blame his wife for the taint she had brought into his line. The marriage withered, and when the Spanish throne itself fell in 1931 and swept the whole family into exile, Ina's place within it never recovered. There was a terrible symmetry to it all, visible only from the far end of the story. Victoria had gathered her grandchildren about her on the lawns of Osborne and among the hills above Balmoral, a whole generation of little cousins, dressed alike, photographed together, dandled in turn upon the knee of the same small and imperious old woman. Among them were a future king and emperor of the British, George, a future German Kaiser, Wilhelm, and the grave little girl, Alex, who would grow up to be the last empress of Russia. She had meant them to be a family, and through that family to hold the peace of the world. Instead, in the summer of 1914, the house that she had built turned upon itself. Her grandchildren and their husbands led their nations down into the trenches against one another in a war that would kill millions and pull down the thrones of Germany, Russia, and Austria together. The empire of cousins she had raised to keep the peace helped, in the end, to set the world on fire. She had seeded her disease into the palaces of St. Petersburg and Madrid, set her grandchildren against one another on the road to catastrophe. But Victoria did not need to look abroad to find heartbreak. She had only to look at her own 9 children, and the fates that awaited them were stranger and darker than any curse from a fairy tale. 9 children. She had borne them across 17 years, and from the cradle she had arranged them like pieces upon a board, betrothing them, marrying them into the courts of Prussia and Russia and Hesse, until the blood of Kensington ran in half the palaces of the continent. She had ruled them as absolutely as she herself had once been ruled. And now, in the long grey evening of her life, she would be made to watch, one by one, what became of them. One of the 9 already lay in his tomb. Leopold, the frail 8th child, whose blood would not clot, had died at Cannes in the spring of 1884, and we have already followed him into the ground. But he was only the first of the small coffins. For such is the cruel arithmetic of a very long life, it outlasts the people who fill it. Victoria lived to 81, and she would bury not one child but several, standing dry-eyed and iron-willed at the graves of those she had governed with so hard a hand. The eldest had been her pride. Victoria, Princess Royal, Vicky to the family, was the clever one. Daughter Albert had loved best and schooled most carefully, a mind shaped to carry her father's liberal dream into the heart of Germany. At barely 17, she was married to Prince Frederick of Prussia and went to Berlin, freighted with her parents' hope that she and her husband would one day reign over a united, enlightened Germany. For 30 years she waited for that day. When it came at last, it lasted 99 days. Frederick came to the throne as German Emperor in the March of 1888, already a dying man, his voice all but eaten away by a cancer of the throat. He reigned barely 3 months, then was gone, and the crown passed to his son. That son was Wilhelm, Vicky's own boy, born with a withered arm and, it would seem, a colder heart, who had swallowed whole the militarism his parents despised. As Kaiser Wilhelm II, he pushed his widowed mother to the very margins of the court she had crossed a continent to reform. And in the summer of 1901, Only months after her own mother's death, Vicky followed, killed by a cancer of the breast that had crept, in secret, along her spine. The favoured daughter outlived the mother by barely half a year. The heir had been her grief. Vicky was the child Victoria loved. Bertie, Albert, Edward, Prince of Wales, was the child she could not forgive. From that first winter of her widowhood, she had blamed him for the shock she believed had hurried his father into the grave, and something in her never truly thawed again. For the whole of her long reign, she kept him from the machinery of the crown. No real duty, no share in the business of state he was born to inherit, and despaired of the idle, pleasure-seeking man the empty decades made of him. Twice she watched him dragged into the witness box of a public court, once in a divorce suit, once in a squalid scandal over cards. He waited as no heir in English history ever had, and did not become King Edward VII until he was 59. A whole life lived out in the cold shadow of his mother's contempt. But the cruelest fate of the nine fell upon the gentlest of them, and it fell upon the one day in all the year the family had learned to dread above every other. Liz was the third child, the second daughter, the tender one, who had nursed her father through his last illness and cradled her shattered mother through the first black nights that followed. In 1862 she married Prince Louis of Hesse and went to live at Darmstadt, deep in Germany, where she raised a large family and earned a name for kindness and quiet good works. She was no stranger to sorrow. One small son, a hemophiliac like his uncle Leopold, had fallen from a window to his death, but nothing had prepared her for the winter of 1878. That autumn, diphtheria came to the house at Darmstadt. One after another her children fell to it, the choking, smothering terror of the Victorian nursery, and her husband with them. Alice nursed them herself, moving from bed to bed, week upon week, refusing to leave the sick rooms. In November, the youngest little Marie, May, they called her, a child of 4, lost her struggle and died. And Alice, terrified of breaking the spirits of the others still fighting for their lives, kept the death a secret from them as long as she could bear to. Then came the moment that has haunted the story ever since. Her son Ernest, weak but mending, had at last to be told that his little sister was gone. The boy wept so piteously that Alice, forgetting for one fatal instant the pitiless caution of the sick room, bent down and kissed him, a mother comforting her grieving child. It was that single unguarded kiss, her doctors believed afterward, that passed the sickness into her. Within days she too had fallen ill, and she did not rise again. Alice died on the 14th of December, 1878. It was the 17th anniversary, to the very day, of the death of her father, Prince Albert. The date that had shattered Victoria in 1861 had come round again, 17 years on, to claim one of the children who had stood weeping at that first deathbed. The Queen received the news at Windsor and set down in her journal the horror of the coincidence. This terrible day, she wrote, come round again. The 14th of December had taken her husband. Now it had taken her daughter. To Victoria it seemed less like chance than like a curse that kept a calendar. The fourth child fared little better, though his ruin came slowly. Alfred Affey was the sailor the second son made his career in the Royal Navy, and in 1874 an unhappy marriage to the Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna, the only surviving daughter of the Tsar of Russia. She found England dull and beneath her. He grew distant and drank steadily through the long slide of a disappointed life. His only son, another Alfred, came to grief in a scandal the family laboured to bury, and died young. By his own hand, it was whispered, in the winter of 1899. Scarcely a year later, in the summer of 1900, the father followed him, killed by the same cancer of the throat that had silenced the German emperor. Not every fate was a tragedy. Some were merely quiet. Helena, the fifth child, made a modest match with an impoverished German prince, Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, on the firm condition laid down by her mother that the couple remain in England, within reach, always. She passed her life close by the Queen's side, dutiful and unremarkable. One of the daughters kept near to serve as nurse and secretary to a widow's loneliness. Louise VI was the beauty and the restless one, a gifted artist and sculptor chafing inside the Gilded family, who married not a foreign princeling but a British aristocrat, the Marquess of Lorne. The marriage gave her no children, and, by most accounts, little warmth. And about Louise there gathered a haze of rumour, of lovers taken even in the darker whispers, of a child born in secret in her girlhood and spirited away. None of it was ever proved. But she was clever and beautiful and unhappy, and such women, in that buttoned age, were never long without gossip. And then there was Arthur, the seventh child, and, everyone understood, his mother's favourite. He was the soldier of the family, steady, dutiful, untroubled, the Duke of Connaught, who brought her no scandal and cost her no grief. Alone among the nine, he lived a long, serene and fortunate life, and did not die until 1942, in the midst of yet another world war, at the great age of 91. He outlived his mother by more than 40 years. But it was the last of the nine who paid the strangest price of all. Beatrice, Baby, the family called her, and the name clung to her cruelly into middle age, was the youngest, born in 1857, only 4 years before her father died. She kept no memory of him at all. And precisely because she was the last, Victoria resolved that she should never be permitted to leave. She was to be the staff of her mother's old age, companion, nurse, secretary, the soft voice forever at the elbow of the black-clad Queen. For years the Queen would not suffer the subject of Beatrice's marriage even to be raised in her hearing, and when at last the girl fell in love with the handsome Prince Henry of Battenberg, her mother answered by refusing to speak to her for months on end. She relented at length, but upon one unbreakable condition, that the couple live with her beneath her roof for as long as she lived. On that hard bargain they married in 1885. And when Henry, restless in his gilded confinement, went off to a colonial war in Africa and died of fever on the voyage home in 1896, Beatrice returned to her mother's side, widowed and dutiful, exactly where she had begun. The keeper, in the end, of the vast private journals that would one day pass into her hands alone. But that reckoning still lay ahead. One by one she outlived and buried the children she had ruled so absolutely. And in her loneliness, the last twilight of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the old Queen turned to the unlikeliest companion of her entire life, a young man newly arrived from India, whose very name her family would one day spend years trying to erase from history. By the summer of 1887, Victoria had worn the crown for 50 years. Her golden jubilee, half a century upon the throne, drew tribute from every corner of an empire that now circled the globe, and from no corner more lavishly than the greatest jewel of it all. For a decade, she had been not merely Queen, but Empress of India, sovereign over hundreds of millions of subjects on the far side of the earth. And yet India, to her, was only a word, a map, a case of gems. She had never once set foot upon it. She never would. So when, in that Jubilee summer, 2 Indian servants arrived to wait upon her table, a living gift dispatched from the court of her Indian empire, the old Queen studied them with the deep fascination of a woman meeting for the very first time a country she had owned for 10 years. One of them was a tall, grave, striking young man of about 24, named Mohammed Abdul Karim. He had come to carry dishes and clear plates, a servant among the Queen's servants. He did not remain one for long. Something in the young man caught the Queen's eye and then held it fast. She found him dignified, where the others were merely deferential. and almost at once she began to single him out. She asked him of his home of India, of his language, and his faith. He was a Muslim from near the city of Agra, and within the year she had reached an extraordinary decision. He would wait at table no longer. He would become her teacher, her Munshi, the Hindustani word for a clerk or an instructor, and from him she would learn the very tongue of the empire she had never seen. And so, night after night, the Queen Empress of India sat down like a schoolgirl before her young Indian tutor and copied out the flowing characters of Urdu into her journals. She kept it up for more than a decade, filling notebook after notebook with careful lines of Hindustani and greeting Indian visitors in the phrases he had taught her. Under his influence, a whole new passion for the subcontinent bloomed in her. She delighted in Indian dress and Indian faces and Indian things, and had built at Osborne a vast and glowing Durbar room, carved and moulded in the Mughal manner, a corner of India, set down upon the Isle of Wight. He brought the flavours of his country to her table too, curries prepared to his own direction, which she took to at once, and kept upon the royal menu for the rest of her life. And he spoke to her of India's peoples and faiths and quarrels, and she listened as she had listened to no servant since a blunt Highland gillie had died and left her alone in the world. For that, in the end, was what Abdul Karim became, the second of her forbidden favourites. Where John Brown had filled the emptiness of the body, the strong arm, the fearless guard, the plain-spoken friend, the Munshi filled some other emptiness, the vast loneliness of a very old woman at the summit of the world, with almost no one left who would simply sit and talk to her. But the court had at least been able to tell itself that Brown, for all his roughness, was a Scot, a Christian, a known quantity. The Munshi was none of these things. And so the hatred that gathered about him ran hotter still and wore an uglier face. For as she had with Brown, she showered upon him a favour that scandalized everyone around her. He was given his own carriage, and servants of his own. He was granted cottages at Windsor, at Osborne, at Balmoral, the Munshi's houses they were called. He was awarded honours and a title, made a companion of the Order of the Indian Empire. His portrait was painted in oils and hung upon her walls. His family was brought over from India and lodged at her expense. A grant of land was settled upon him near Agra. She raised him in time to be her Indian secretary, and let him stand among the great officers of her court while she received her guests. She named him her teacher and her friend, and she is said to have signed her notes to him as his loving mother, his closest friend. She wished him, in plain fact, to be treated not as a servant, but as a gentleman of her court. And that was the one thing her court would not, could not, abide. For the household rose against him almost as a single body. To the courtiers and the relations gathered about the aging queen, the raising up of Abdul Karim was an affront past bearing, and their outrage wore quite nakedly the face of the age's racism. They would not sit at table with him. They refused to share a railway carriage with him. They sneered at his origins and dug for proof that he was a fraud, insisting that his father was no surgeon, as the Munshi let it be believed, but a humble apothecary at a jail, and that the whole proud story of his birth was a fabrication. They whispered that he was a spy, that the confidential papers laid before the Queen were being read over her shoulder and passed to hostile hands, that he was leaking her secrets to Muslim agitators, that he was a standing danger to the state. Some of these charges were quietly investigated. Not one of them was ever proved. But the household pressed them all the same, year upon year, in a long and patient campaign to sever the Queen's attachment and drive the Indian from her side. Victoria met that campaign with fury. She knew precisely what lay beneath the complaints, and she named it without flinching. It was, she said, nothing but race prejudice, the flat refusal of her own people to see an Indian treated as their equal. She defended him without pause and without limit. When her courtiers objected, she overruled them. When they laid their evidence before her, she swept it aside. The harder they struck at him, the higher and more fiercely she raised him, until those nearest to her began to wonder uneasily, and then aloud, whether the old queen's judgment had at last begun to fail her. The matter came to its crisis near the very end. In 1897, as her court prepared to travel abroad, the Queen's household delivered what amounted to an ultimatum. Her senior attendants, her doctor, her private secretary, the very men who ran her daily life, let it be known that they would resign in a body rather than go on being humiliated by the Munshi's place among them. It was mutiny in all but name. Some went so far as to hint that her devotion to the man was itself a kind of symptom, that her reason, after 60 years upon the throne, might finally be giving way. It was perhaps the last great battle of will in a life that had been built of them. The caged girl who would not sign Conroy's paper, the young queen who faced down her ministers, the widow who defied a whole nation's impatience with her grief, and now an old woman near 80, half-blind and unbowed, digging in against her entire court for the sake of a servant from Agra. She did not yield. She would not give him up. And for as long as she drew breath, they could not make her. But they did not stop watching, and they did not stop waiting. They had lost the fight while she lived, and so they turned their eyes coldly and patiently toward the one day that would end it. They would burn every letter, seize every photograph, and send him home in disgrace the very hour she was gone. But that reckoning would have to wait, because the Queen, who had reigned longer than any English sovereign in history, was at last, after 81 years, closing her eyes for the final time. At the very summit of her long life, Victoria was no longer merely a queen. She was an idea, vast, remote, almost geological. In 1876, her Parliament passed the Royal Titles Act, and on the first day of 1877, on a dusty plain outside Delhi, amid elephants and cannon and the assembled princes of a subcontinent, she was proclaimed Empress of India. She never set foot in the country she now ruled. She did not need to. Her name ran on the coinage of a quarter of the globe. Her warships held every ocean. Her dominions spread so wide that the sun, it was famously said, could never set upon them. A German-speaking girl, once forbidden to walk downstairs without a hand to hold, had become sovereign over 400 million souls. And twice, in her old age, the world came to London to kneel. In the summer of 1887, 50 years upon the throne, the crowned heads of Europe, her own children and grandchildren among them, processed through the capital for her golden jubilee. 10 years on, in June of 1897, they did it again, grander still for the diamond. 60 years a queen, an anniversary no English sovereign had ever reached. The bells rang out across the whole empire in the same hour. And at the still centre of it, in an open carriage, sat a tiny old woman in unrelieved, black, stout, stern, half-crippled with rheumatism, weeping a little, bowing a little, the living mask of the age she had named. But a mask is not a face. And behind this one, the woman was wearing out. She had, by any reckoning, been extraordinarily difficult to kill. Across the long decades of her reign, no fewer than 7 times a hand had been raised against her, men stepping from the roadside crowd with pistols, one striking at her with a cane, another levelling a weapon as she drove up Constitution Hill, and every time, by luck or bad aim or sheer nerve, she had survived. She had a peculiar genius for outlasting things. She had outlived her mother and her husband. She had outlived John Brown and the whole roaring scandal of him. She had outlived ministers and rivals and the Republican tide that once bade for her to go. And, most cruelly of all, she had outlived her own children. One by one, they had gone ahead of her into the dark. Alice, dead of diphtheria on the terrible anniversary of Albert's own death. Leopold, the bleeder, dead at 30. Alfred, eaten by cancer, dead in the summer of 1900. Each loss was set down in her journal in a hand grown larger and more laborious as her sight dimmed. To outlive a single child is a wound few parents ever truly heal. Victoria had buried 3, and would, though she did not live to learn of it, be followed within months by a 4th. Her eldest daughter Vicky dying in Germany that very year. By the winter of 1900, the great edifice was failing from within. Cataracts had clouded her eyes until she could scarcely read the papers of state. Her legs would no longer carry her. Her appetite and her famous iron memory were alike giving way. She withdrew, at the last, to Osborne House, the seaside palace on the Isle of Wight that Albert himself had designed for her half a century before. Of all her houses, it was the one most thickly haunted by him. It was where she chose to die. The end came slowly through the 3rd week of January 1901. Her children and grandchildren gathered in the hushed house, summoned from across a continent, and waited. And among them, cradling her failing body in his one sound arm for hour upon patient hour, was her grandson, Wilhelm II, German Emperor. It was a strange and almost unbearable irony, though no one in that room could yet see it. The last human warmth the old queen would ever feel was the embrace of the man who within a single generation would lead Germany into the bloodiest war the world had known, against the thrones of her other grandchildren. On the evening of the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House. She was 81 years old, and she had reigned 63 years and 7 months. The longest reign in all of British history, a record that would stand unbroken for more than 100 years. The little woman in black, who was the only monarch most of her subjects had ever known, was gone. And, with her passing, a strange and secret drama, long prepared, began at once to unfold. For Victoria had planned her own death with the same fierce, controlling precision she had brought to her whole life. In the quiet months before the end, she had placed in the hands of her trusted physician, Sir James Reed, a private memorandum, instructions for her own coffin to be carried out by his hand alone. She would not be buried in the black she had worn for 40 years. She was a soldier's daughter and a soldier's widow, she insisted, and hers would be a white funeral. The pall white, the plumes white, the horses of the gun carriage draped in white. And into the coffin itself, at her secret command, went the treasures of her heart. Reed did exactly as instructed. Beneath her body he laid the mementos of the husband she had mourned for 40 years, Albert's dressing gown embroidered by one of their daughters, and a plaster cast of Albert's hand, the very hand she had held as he slipped away in the Blue Room all those years before. So far so fitting. The devoted widow reunited in the grave with her prince. But there was a second layer to her wishes, hidden beneath the first, and this was the one her family was never meant to see. Into the Queen's left hand, Sir James Reed placed a photograph of John Brown. Beside it, he set a lock of the Highlander's hair, and, by several accounts, his mother's wedding ring and one of the letters he had written her. Then, before her children were admitted to look upon their mother one final time, he concealed it all beneath a carefully arranged spray of flowers. And so she went down into the earth with both of them at once, the husband she had worshipped, the servant she had loved, carried together into the dark where her watching children could not part them. Her children, however, had secrets of their own to keep, and scores of their own to settle. The son who now rose as King Edward VII was the same Bertie. His mother had never entirely forgiven, the heir she had blamed, for half his life, for his father's death. He had waited very nearly 60 years for the throne. And he wasted not an hour. Within hours of her last breath, the machinery of erasure begun to turn. The king gave orders that the cottage of Abdul Karim, the Munshi, be searched, and the queen's long, affectionate correspondence with her Indian teacher gathered up and burned. Karim himself was stripped of his honours and sent home to India in disgrace. Then Edward turned to John Brown. The statues taken down, the busts carted away, the memorial jewellery and photographs swept out of sight, the memory of the man scrubbed from the royal houses as thoroughly as a stain from a wall. And there was one last act of quiet editing still to come. To Beatrice, the youngest daughter, the companion and secretary Victoria had kept forever at her side, never once permitted to leave, fell the enormous private journals the Queen had kept, almost without a break, since she was a girl of 13. For the better part of 30 years, dutiful to the end, Beatrice copied them out by hand, volume upon volume, silently omitting whatever she judged too intimate, too wounding, too revealing, and burning the original pages as she finished with each one. The unguarded voice of the real Victoria, the private record of nearly 70 years of her life, was fed, leaf by leaf, into the fire by her own daughter. The woman behind the crown was being edited and censored and tidied away even in death, and so the legend closed over her, smooth and seamless, exactly as her family wished. The stern little face on the coin remained. The mask survived. The woman behind it slipped, at last, out of reach. They buried her in white, as she had asked, a soldier's daughter, laid beside her beloved Albert. And clasped in her hand, hidden beneath the flowers where her children could not see it, was a lock of another man's hair. The secrets went into the ground with her, but some of them refused to stay buried. And that is the truth behind the crown.